Welcome to the Expert Series, where we explore the cutting-edge issues shaping national security and defense. It's Thursday, October 3rd, 2024, and I'm Josh Malm, Director of Research and Analysis for the CDA Institute. In part 3 of our series on Canada's submarine fleet renewal, Mark Norman, Bob Davidson, and Luc Cassivi join me again, this time for a live panel discussion to build on conversations we had in parts 1 and 2. In this episode, we'll discuss accelerating procurement projects like the Submarine Replacement Program, Canada's decision not to pursue nuclear propulsion, considerations surrounding the AUKUS agreement, and the impact of emerging technologies, including unmanned underwater vehicles, on the development of a modernized submarine fleet. This is the Expert Series.
Luc, Bob, Mark, thank you for joining the CDA Institute once again. So today we'll be discussing once again the Victoria-class replacement. In this episode, our audience can expect to hear about the procurement process, collaboration with our allies, nuclear propulsion. We'll talk a little bit about AUKUS and close out with a bit of a discussion on emerging technologies, or at least that's the plan from the outset. So I'll pose this question to the three of you, and perhaps Mark can start. We can then go to maybe Luc and Bob. So for some context for our audience, to address the need for modernizing the Victoria-class fleet, the Canadian government has recently launched the Canadian Patrol Submarine Project to replace the aging class submarines. So as part of this initiative, the government issued a request for information, which is not unusual, to gather insights from defense contractors about potential submarine options and maintenance capabilities. So the RFI serves as an initial step to refine requirements before a possible formal request for proposal. And importantly, it doesn't commit Canada to any specific purchase. So with this context, how could the government plan to engage with international submarine manufacturers and allies to ensure a competitive selection process? Perhaps we could start with Mark.
Well, I mean, they're laying out the process as is defined through the Canadian procurement rules and guidelines at the moment. The wording in the document is interesting too, because they are looking to get to a subsequent level of engagement for the very reasons you're describing. It's a bit of a hybrid, although it's not officially been published as such. It's kind of it's an RFI that could potentially be used, although it's not explicit, as part of the pre-qualification or down selection process. The Crown has to be careful how they play this, because they need to be completely open and transparent. And if they don't tell the bidders what they're doing from the outset, then they could set themselves up for subsequent complaints. But nonetheless, they're doing the right things. They're reaching out now to industry and saying basically, okay, what's out there? Are we this is what we're thinking from a high level requirements perspective. Does this all make sense? And how would you see this playing out, both from both a technical perspective, from a production perspective, schedule, all these kinds of things? I mean, I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the gist of it to get to the heart of your question. I think really, Josh, if I can read between the lines in your question, I think the bigger question here is, how can this process be accelerated? It'll be no surprise to your listeners or any of us on this panel that time is not on our side as we embark on this process. It's long overdue. We don't need to lament how we got where we are, but we are here now. And 2035 is literally a blink of an eye away in strategic procurement timelines. And so, if the Crown is going to spend an inordinate amount of time up front analyzing, refining, and playing in the details of the promulgated process, you burn up the available airspeed and altitude, if I can use a flying analogy, that's available to actually land this program pretty quickly. So, one of the questions is, in essence, how quickly could the different suppliers actually produce submarine. And this is where I think there's a real tension. I think this is going to play out as one of the key areas of concern going forward. You know, the ability to move this program quickly is directly proportional to how off the shelf, if I can put it that way, the Crown is prepared to be. And by the Crown, I mean all of the entities within the government. So that includes the end user, the Navy, that includes the materiel people who have a huge piece to play in this. That includes the procurement people, and sadly, that includes every other department that thinks they have an opinion on this. But the real challenge here is we don't have a great track record of doing these things quickly, unless we decide to buy direct, which is still an option. And I'm not trying to hijack the conversation, but I'm just saying this is where the tension, I think, is going to play out. The good news is there are a handful of legitimate, viable options that are out there in various states of availability, and you know, we're not starting with necessarily with a clean sheet of paper, so to speak. So I'm just going to leave it at that, and then we can take it from there. Over.
Thanks, Mark. Well, let's turn to Luc now, and then before we go to Bob.
Yeah, just a few things to add. I agree with the majority of what's been said so far. Obviously, I guess I would say that so far, the main client, the Navy, has pretty much they're doing all they can to accelerate what they control and squeeze the timeline, knowing that they stood up late and they have a hard requirement in the mid-30s to have a platform ready. But depending on the priorities of the government of the day, when we get to further down the process, we'll have an election between now and then, at least one, and the priorities of that government, where how quickly the rest of the federal family, the rest of the members of the Crown, move this process forward is left to be seen. So there will be challenges there. It really needs to be a whole government effort, and that the new government will get to set those priorities. As far as the engagement to industry, I agree that the right things are being done. I think as we mature this, and I think that's a challenge in Canada compared to other countries in how we relate to industry. We have a very standoffish, a very, prevent all kinds of conflict of interest, which means that, we have a process that takes a lot more time than it could otherwise. And we don't necessarily get to the answer we want as quickly as we could. So, I don't think that's going to change. I know that the department is seized on that. The minister is seized on that reality. How can we engage better with industry? But I think as it relates to this process right now, it's moving along as would be intended. The team will get smarter, and then the process will move forward. But again, getting the speed of everybody and the speed of trust with everybody else to move this to a contract will be quite a challenge.
Thanks, Luc. Bob?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. Largely agree with what's been said. Certainly the project is going to be competitive. I mean, going out to yards, essentially globally does ensure a certain degree of competitiveness. So I'm not particularly worried about that. And the other aspect I would say is, yes, the timeline is critical, but foreign yards have the ability to meet that timeline. And in fact, I would argue that there's capability to meet it even faster than we're prepared to go to contract at the moment. There is capacity out there. And the question is, are we prepared to latch onto it? Now, the key element in moving forward, I think Mark's already mentioned, but it really comes down to how much we want to Canadianize the design. And that's the killer. Every time we've done a major project, we've done far too much Canadianization. I sure hope we've learned that lesson, but perfection is the enemy of good enough here. And there are designs out there that are available now, and we don't want to start into a design process, because if we get into a design process, we're never going to meet the timeline that we're talking about. As Mark has clearly said, we're already against the stops. And so, we don't want to go down those particular paths. I think we also need to remember that Canadian yards are already busy with fleet recapitalization through the National Shipbuilding Strategy. And the other thing that we always seem to be falling back on as being a worry is, how much money is being spent in Canada. The reality is, even if we're buying these submarines offshore, the vast majority of the money that will be involved in a submarine project will be spent here in Canada in terms of in-service support, spares, et cetera, where we can definitely get into all of those areas. But also, of course, the long-term sustainment of the Navy, salaries, training, infrastructure, and all of those things is all money that's going to be spent here. So I don't think we need to worry about how much is going to be spent in Canada, nor do I think we need to worry about competitiveness, nor do I think we need to worry that foreign yards can meet our requirements.
Hey, Josh, it's Mark. I think Luc and Bob have made a couple of really important points for your listeners here as we set up the rest of the conversation. And I'm going to pick on one point each. Luc's point about the relationship with industry is really, really important because it does speak to what I would characterize. I'll be a little less polite than he was. It's a complete lack of sophistication on our part. We treat these things transactionally, and we're very, very either uncomfortable or unfamiliar, and it's probably a combination of both, with the notion of real partnerships with industry, which is how you're really going to get things done, especially if you want to compress time. And Bob's point, one of them he mentioned capacity. And we've got to make a distinction here between industry capacity, which pretty much, as he indicated, is, depending on who you're talking about, is pretty much there. In fact, he said that it's probably better than we think it is in some cases, and that industry could probably move faster, which speaks to the other problem of capacity, which is the capacity inside the machinery of government to actually move this through the process. And that really concerns me because if we're going to continue to behave the way we have, if we're going to continue to live, as Luc described, with this transactional, it's almost a confrontational relationship with industry. That's problematic in itself. The number of people that are involved in this project are shockingly low. I think your listeners would be shocked that we're probably in the order of maybe a dozen people across the entire government who are focused on this, either full-time or part-time. So anyway, I just wanted to emphasize those 2 points before we went on to the next discussion.
Sure. Would anyone like to respond or build on that? Luc, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, if I may, Josh, just a point, because it speaks to both that last and what Bob mentioned. If we look at, and without doing a full analysis of lessons learned of the past, but we have challenges as it exists today that are largely based on an industrial base that is immature because as a consequence of these relationships and not having invested enough in those strategic relationships to have a reliable industrial base to support the capability when it's in service. We have the opportunity as we embark on this journey to lay the foundation to actually have a healthier industrial base so that we have successful employment at that platform going forward. Because if we don't ensure that we have that industrial base, it'll be a nice acquisition project, but we won't get the seat time and the effect that we want out of the platform otherwise, even if it's new, right? Like they're unique projects. They're not. It's not a Ford factory line here, right? So we'll need that capacity, and I think there's an opportunity to change our mindset as we move forward on this project.
Thanks for your comments, Luc. Bob, do you have anything to add before we move on to another part of the discussion?
No, I think they both covered it. I think we can move on.
Perfect. So next I'd like to talk nuclear submarines briefly. So while nuclear-powered submarines offer distinct advantages, including longer operational endurance, greater stealth, Canada has opted to focus on conventional submarines for its next fleet. So maybe this time we'll start with Bob and go Luc and Mark. What are the strategic priorities influencing Canada's focus on conventional submarines over the nuclear option, and how do these priorities align with the current security landscape?
Interestingly, I would say that most of the debate around nuclear submarines is around capability, and there are a lot of, I'm going to be impolite and say armchair experts out there who are clamoring for us to go down that path. And what they're missing is that there's a much broader dimension to going to nuclear versus a conventional capability. Where that really starts is, and let's just start with the people. The crew sizes are much larger. We already have a problem with our recruiting challenge at the moment with the Navy. They're working hard to address that, but we're short people. We're starting with a small base of qualified submariners at the moment. And so to grow that capacity to fit a submarine fleet that was nuclear is, impossible to imagine as far as I'm concerned. Not only from the sheer challenge of creating the right number of people and training them, but there's also the enormous impact on the costs for the Navy if, you're going to have a crew of 100 per boat versus potentially 30. The impact on the Navy overall is huge. So that's the first thing I'd say. Then the second thing I would say is the infrastructure requirements for nuclear. The refueling of reactors, the nuclear energy, also the training of nuclear experts to go to sea in submarines. All of those kinds of aspects also create enormous obstacles. So now let's turn to the capability side. Oh yes, of course you can get anywhere you want to go in the world faster in a nuclear submarine. You can sustain unsubmerged operations for longer periods of time because the near limitless amount of energy you have to, create the air or the environment, the energy, create water, fresh water, all the things that you can do in a submarine, an almost unlimited nuclear submarine in an almost unlimited capacity. Those are all great things. But then let's look at where do we really expect to operate? And what's the environment going to be when we do so? And you've heard me mention before that the Arctic is changing rapidly. Let's not pick a submarine that's designed to go under a polar ice cap of many meters of ice when there's really no need for us to be under the North Pole itself because our allies are there. What we want to be is fundamentally in the approaches to our own archipelago. From an Arctic perspective, and we can achieve all of that in the environment that we can expect in 2040 and beyond with a conventional submarine. So all of that to me says that reopening the door to analysis to go back and take a look at a nuclear submarine, we've already mentioned how tight we are on schedule. The last thing we need is another analysis that will identify all the problems that the Navy already knows. It's the Navy. And I've had this conversation with the commander in the Navy. They don't want a nuclear submarine for all of those reasons, because it's going to be a bridge too far.
Bob, thank you for those insights. Luc?
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Bob. I couldn't agree more, but a few different vectors to address where people's mindset may be around this. I think for all the reason Bob described nuclear submarines for replacing this class of submarines, it makes no sense. Okay, we can't get there. Even the production capability in our allies is already under stress on the AUKUS with the Australians coming on board now. The U.S. is not making their own domestic production requirements. It's going to be a long run for the Australians, and the British have similar problems when it comes to that. That's if you want to go there as a nation building, long-term planning, and it's the submarines after the next class. If we want to have the discussion started today, maybe in 30 years we'd be ready and would have built the capacity through time and with our allies to get there. But do we really need to be there? And there's a discussion with our allies, particularly in continental defense, being the U.S., as to how do we complement each other. And I think if you talk to a lot of strategists, they say, it'd be great that you have very capable diesels to complement us in the continental defense spectrum, because that allows us to do things that their boats can do, and that'd be a welcome thing. So I would put that, and the country needs to, and this is not we can turn into criticism, but the level of investment when it comes to how much Canadians through their democratic decisions at election time are willing to spend on defense to sustain capabilities and being able to defend the homeland comes to play a lot, because that infrastructure is usually specialized, very expensive. And as I used to jokingly tell friends when they ask me, I say, well, there's a clear way to make sure we're at 3% of GDP in defense spending, acquire a nuclear submarine fleet. That'll get you there fairly quickly. So those are the things I would add on to what Bob has contributed.
Luc, thanks for those reflections. I appreciate them. Mark, do you have anything to add to this discussion?
Well, I'll give you a couple things that will likely help you to transition to the AUKUS discussion, because I suspect that's where you're going to want to take us next, because Bob mentioned it. I agree with everything Bob and Luc have said. I would add the refinement of two issues. One is the cost. It will be exorbitant. We're being polite, and it would bankrupt the armed forces, if you want to put it that way. And the second is the politics of this. And it concerns me not just because it's, I'm going to go as far as to say, it's a great idea that's not practical or realistic. So let's just move on. The issue is that we politicize major defense procurements in this country. It's not unusual, but it is problematic. And when we politicize them, often bad things happen or unhelpful things happen. And there is a history of governments coming and governments going and making arbitrary and arguably stupid decisions that then cost time, money, and capability over the life cycle of the armed forces. Throwing a nuclear submarine option into the mix will be extremely unhelpful. I suspect the Aussies themselves are going to be, we're already starting to see the challenges that they're experiencing, and I suspect they're going to get harder as this goes forward. And I think there's a lot of other high-end capabilities across the full spectrum of the inventory of the armed forces that could be far more useful strategically than pursuing this option. So I'm agreeing with my colleagues, and we'll just take it from there.
Well, thanks very much, Mark. Does anyone have anything to add before we move on?
Just to pile on to the AUKUS point, there are people that believe that we missed the train, not being on board the train on AUKUS at the beginning. I would suggest that as the Australians move forward, and there's always already a lot of concern coming out of Australia about just what they've signed themselves up to, but I think there's a high probability that we're going to see that train is not going anywhere fast for Australia, and that we are going to be much better off not being on a nuclear submarine train like they are. But while, we can say that, obviously there are other elements of AUKUS that are important, most notably Four Eyes. And as long as we can retain an ability to exchange information in both the maritime and submarine domains in this particular case, through Four Eyes, then we don't need to be in AUKUS necessarily. Not to say that there aren't going to be some aspects of it that are going to be worthwhile, but again, I think folks are looking at that through rose-colored glasses, and it's not necessarily where we want to be.
Great. Thanks, Bob. So as Mark mentioned earlier, we're going to discuss AUKUS a little more for this next 5 to 10 minutes. So for our listeners who might not be aware, Canada is currently or has been in discussions with the UK, US, and Australia about potentially joining the pact, which focuses on enhancing security in the Indo-Pacific through mostly a nuclear submarine program for Australia. Now, Canadian military leaders have expressed concern about the exclusion from this agreement, especially as the need to replace our Victoria-class submarines has become more pressing. So with this said, maybe we'll start with Luc this time. What is the feasibility of Canada joining the AUKUS Security Pact? What are the potential benefits and risks and commitments that would accompany such a decision?
Thanks, Josh. I'll try to open this smartly and my colleagues will obviously have a lot to say also. So AUKUS, as it relates to Victoria class, I think we've made the case nuclear makes no sense for Canada at this point in where we are, and let's not get our egos too bruised out of this. There is a second pillar outside of the submarine technology sharing, which is of greater interest to Canada, not just the Navy, but the whole of the Canadian Armed Forces. I think Jacques was one of the clear voices as I need what's being discussed and developed there when it comes to cyber capability, what will come out of quantum computing, for example, on crewed vehicles of various sorts, a whole bunch of technology development that will take place. And I think that's a very good area for us to contemplate being part of that ecosystem. And it opens also some great opportunities for Canadian industry and Canadian research and development into some pretty fascinating piece. Like we have some lead researchers in Canada recognized worldwide in artificial intelligence, in quantum computing, etc. There's still a very, very significant capability that have not only defense, in the period of CAF to use, but also in protecting some of the infrastructure in Canada that every Canadian rely on, on a day-to-day basis when it comes to the cyber world. So I think there's great inroads to be made there. I know some leaders are captured with having those discussions, but we need to be willing to invest in it too. It's not just join to get the benefit of what others are doing. We need to pull our weight as we face those elements of contribution to deliver on what Pillar 2 can be. That would be my comments on this point.
Well, thanks for that opening and for that scene setter, Luc. Mark, I think we're curious to hear what your perspective is.
Yeah, so I mean, Luc laid it out really nicely. I'd like to just kind of simplify it for your listeners. So if we look at this in three buckets, okay, there's phase one, which has two buckets. There's the nuclear submarine bucket, and then there's the emerging technology bucket. And then the third bucket is where do they take the next bound of the relationship? There are already conversations amongst allies, traditional and non-traditional, in the Indo-Pacific, Japan, South Korea, for example, about what a expansion of kind of version 2 of AUKUS might look like, who might be involved, and how those areas of technology can be further explored, bolstered, or maybe even added to. And I think Luc's point is really important with respect to the responsibility to contribute. We look at NORAD, where it's not a formula, but it's kind of like a 90-10 relationship, and there is growing expectation, and we're seeing it play out in the last couple of years, especially where allies are looking to each other to help out. And so it's not just about information sharing. It's about certain areas of technology where certain countries are going to be asked to take a lead, um, and to pursue the research, the development. And as Luc said, that's not just an intellectual component to that. It's a capacity issue and it's a funding issue. So I think it is a great opportunity. I think it is an important thing to be part of. But you know, it's not, it's not a club you just join to have bragging rights about being part of the club. There's a significant expectation of an ongoing contribution once you've been admitted to the membership. And I think that that's going to be a key part of the actual conversation. Thanks.
Mark, thanks for your thoughts. Bob, we'll turn to you now.
Well, let's be realistic. Why was it created in the first place? Well, Australia wasn't getting the kind of capability, submarine capabilities they wanted elsewhere. They were interested in a nuclear submarine. Who else were they going to go to get involved in this other than the UK and the US? And the UK and the US had interest. So they go about starting to develop some kind of cooperative agreement to move this forward. And naturally, they're also going to create other pillars besides the submarine capability, because it's sensible to do that, to have, a broader agreement that allows you to move forward. So they've created an agreement with multiple pillars and maybe more to come. Okay. So why not Canada at the beginning? Well, we weren't looking at a nuclear submarine, so we wouldn't have been involved in those initial discussions. Also, let's be frank, Canada has not been pulling its weight in terms of percentage spending as a percentage of GDP, in the global community. And so, this is a great way for the U.S. to kind of send a message to us that we haven't been pulling our weight, and maybe we aren't always going to be invited to every organization going forward. But yes, maybe we can join a separate pillar if there are additional pillars as they move forward. That all makes sense. So yes, is it important for Canada to get involved in AUKUS in the other pillar areas? Absolutely. Just like we've been involved in the Four Eyes community, this is something we would want to be involved in. It makes absolutely nothing but sense to do so. So yes, we need to move forward on it, and we need to look for ways that we can value add to the cooperative agreement. If we're not going to value add, then what's in it for the other partners to open it up and just have another hanger on at the meetings and at the discussions? So we clearly need to look hard at where we can value add. And as Luc has intimated, maybe there is some future where Canada could be involved in nuclear submarines. So let's not close any doors. Let's keep doors open. But let's also not get too worried at this stage that we're somehow left out of some club. Let's just look for where it's important for us to be involved and what we can contribute to those organizations.
Bob, thanks for your thoughts. Would anyone like to comment on anything Bob said before we move on to the next subject? I'd like to focus a bit on emerging tech and unmanned, underwater unmanned vehicles now. So as the development of UUVs accelerates, traditional manned submarines face new challenges and opportunities within naval strategies. UUVs promise enhanced capabilities while minimizing human risk and operational costs. And this has prompted some militaries around the world to reassess their maritime strategies. For us in Canada, having significant maritime interests, I think it's crucial to account for the implications of UUV advancements, particularly in terms of the Victoria-class replacement. So with this said, how could or should Canada reevaluate its submarine strategy in light of the advancements in UUVs and their potential impact on traditional naval operations? Mark, would you like to take a stab at this one first?
Okay, well, what I'll try and do is set the stage for Luc and Bob, who are more in the practitioner business here. First, let me offer two thoughts. The first thing is that as these technologies emerge, and perhaps for your listeners, this is analogous to the kinds of things we're seeing play out, for example, in Ukraine. Although there is some really interesting underwater autonomous systems being used in that theater, I'm really trying to paint a picture, start to imagine the degree of automation and unmanned systems that are being reported on regularly, open source. Start to imagine how that could play out in the underwater domain that a lot of people don't understand. But just use your imagination, okay? But even with that, it's important to realize that these new capabilities are complementary to manned submarines. I think that's an important starting point for the conversation. There is no idea at the moment, at least within what I would describe as a reasonable timeline, several decades, the rest of my lifetime anyway, that we're going to see a complete replacement. And the analogy I would use once again is, notwithstanding the incredible progress and technological revolution that's playing out on the battlefield in Ukraine, there's still a role for tanks, okay, and armor. They haven't been made completely obsolete, although there's lots of people who would suggest that they are. But the point is that this is not a binary conversation. So that's the first thing. The unmanned systems are designed to complement the manned systems. The second thing is from a conversational perspective, the challenge we have, especially here in Canada, is whenever we start to have these types of discussions, they are seen as they tend to interrupt and obstruct and distract, and probably some other verbs. But where I'm getting at here is that we can't afford to have a conversation where we stop moving the submarine replacement program while somebody thinks that there's a better idea out there. And that's how we tend to approach things in the Canadian context. And I just want to make sure that we don't become seduced by that. And I think that there is enormous room for us to do that. We are a technology leader in some dimensions of underwater acoustics and robotics and those kinds of things. We have not harnessed the full capacity of our domestic industry in that regard. So I think this is an area where we should be doing a lot more, but it cannot come at the expense from a capacity perspective or from a funding perspective of the need to continue to pursue the submarine program. So those are my opening kind of framing comments. Thanks.
Mark, thanks for that. Let's turn to Bob and then Luc.
Let me talk about some of the technical aspects to build on to what Mark has already said. What's the reason UUVs are complementary is because they can't do all of the jobs. And one of the jobs that they cannot do is apply kinetic effect, firing a torpedo or whatever capability. You cannot guarantee from an independent unmanned platform. Are we really prepared to put kinetic effect into the hands of artificial intelligence? No, I don't think so. Do we have an environment that's conducive to continuous communications with an underwater platform? No. A couple of things apply here. One is, communicating through water is not as easy as it is communicating through air. You don't have high data rates. You don't have guaranteed communications. You don't have to deal with the vagaries of the acoustic profile and salinity and all of those things that can bend waves. So all of those things mean that continuous communications with an unmanned vehicle cannot be guaranteed, and you don't want to give the unmanned vehicle kinetic effect. Let's also remember that this is, one of the main operating areas is the high Arctic. where you cannot put a geostationary satellite to provide continuous communication. So you'd actually have to have a constellation of satellites that are there to provide continuous capability. Again, massively increasing the overall costs. How is the platform going to be communicating back when it has information, acoustic information, for example, that needs to, is it all going to be processed on board automatically, or do you need an operator input to clarify the kind of information you're getting? All of those things tend to make underwater vehicles useless in a kinetic capability at the moment. They are useful in a surveillance capability, going out, gathering data, coming back to the surface perhaps and doing a burst communication of, hey, I found something. You guys need to do something about it. But you're not going to be able to deal with it with an intellectual operator at the point of decision making that can follow the directions that you can be certain of. So all of these things tend to mean that UUVs are just simply not able to replace a submarine today. The whole value of a submarine really is that it's an area denial platform, and it doesn't have that effect if it doesn't have kinetic effect.
Thanks, Bob. We'll turn to Luc.
Well, I think Mark and Bob have done a great job in setting the scene. I would just add a few more things to complement where we are at today. So yes, it's a long road from where we are now to Ender's Game. Okay. We're not going to get there in our lifetime, but the technology will evolve. So what is really important is that folks keep tabs on how technology evolves, both in theory and in practice, into what's happening in theaters of operation today. Okay. And we're seeing that in space when it comes to UAVs. So let's gather the same lessons. If you look at the RFI for the Victoria class, I think the team is being very realistic in looking at how uncrewed vehicles can be used through these platforms to extend the sensor capability and the influence of the next generation submarines for Canada. And particularly for Arctic operations, I think that they'll be very useful, but in many other areas that are of key interest to Canada, particularly in underbed or seabed warfare. Okay, in the sense of we're seeing how other nations are trying to take advantage of some fairly important infrastructure that lies in the seabed and that are crucial to the daily operations of society. Those cables across the Atlantic are super important for the exchange of financial data and the like. It's still not all going through satellites, for example, right? We saw what happened with some of the pipelines. So, so there's an emerging level, type of warfare with this technology that's getting very sophisticated a lot quickly. And we just need to exploit it where we can, get smarter about it, play with it. And who knows where the future will take us. I agree with everything that Mark and Bob said, particularly from a technology perspective. We're not there yet. It may be there in the future. It doesn't stop us from dreaming. It doesn't stop R&D folks and scientists and the likes from imagining how that could be done and evolve these capabilities through time. We want that to happen. But for now, it will be a submarine supplemented, extending its range, extending its influence through those tools that are becoming more sophisticated, more available.
Thank you, Luc. We started this conversation with a brief discussion about procurement, and I'd like to close out the discussion and come full circle a little bit. So, given the projected timeline for operational deployment of the Victoria-class replacement is around 2037, what strategies would you say Canada can implement to mitigate potential capability gaps during that transition? And building on that and building on, how we just started this discussion, are there any reforms you have in mind that could be necessary in Canada's procurement process to ensure it can adapt quickly and more rapidly to technological advancements and just generally improve program integrity? So there's about maybe 2 or 3 questions in there, but perhaps I can let Bob take a stab at it, and then we'll go Mark and Luc.
I don't think we want to start from the assumption that 2037 is a good timeline. I think we want to start from the assumption that 2037 is already way too late. We're going to have enormous challenges doing the transition already, and frankly, I'm not sure that the Victoria class is going to operate that long. We're already struggling to keep those platforms in the ocean, and so, I think. As I mentioned at the start of this conversation, we need to look to industry to see if there are ways to advance that. Now, we always say, oh, no, that's not possible because of our long procurement process. Well, this is where there is flexibility. We have moved forward much faster when operational requirements were there in the past. You look back at us getting C-17s and how quickly we got those in order to operate in Afghanistan, because we were buying commercially off the shelf a capability that existed. We have done that before with urgent operational requirements. The fact of the matter is, if we're prepared to buy offshore and if there's yard capacity out there, we can move this much faster. We just need to get government to agree to it and to understand that the typical things that they expect in a big commercial project like this, the made in Canada aspects, we may have to compromise on those front end. But let's remember, as I've said before, it's the back end where most of the money is spent, and that'll still be spent in Canada. It's still going to be in service support. Any manufacturer that we pick to build this submarine for us will be able to liaise with Canadian industry and build domestic capacity to continue the service support of these submarines going forward. That's where the money is for Canada. That's where our yards know there's money for them, and that's where we can get all of those elements in place. So, what can we do differently? Well, we simply need to identify this as an urgent operational requirement, identify for government that there's things that we can do, and identify that whichever yard we go with, there will be a strategic partnership that will be created here. Whether we go to a European yard or an Asian yard, for these submarines, these people are going to be prepared to work with us to build a strategic capability, and we'll be prepared to work Navy to Navy in this respect as well. And so let's look for the shortcuts and move forward and not fall back on we've never done it this quick before. It's impossible to do now, because that's a pessimistic approach that will almost certainly mean that we end up with a capability gap.
Bob, thank you for providing your remarks. Very insightful. Mark, do you have anything to add to what Bob said?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything, and I would complement it with a couple of comments for your listeners. First of all, to the issue of urgency and the reality of the timeline, Bob's entirely correct. The reason we have the Victoria class is that we were looking to use it as an interim capability. It was never intended as a full generational replacement. It's ended up becoming so for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into. So, the transition is significant. It is not easily done. It is not a turnkey thing. So the longer we drag this out, the more problematic it is going to be, as Bob explains. I see this, I'm a very visual person. I imagine this, if you were to use a Venn diagram in your head, you've got capacity, process, and money, or capacity, process, and time. There's other components as well. And if you allow the process to run its natural course, it will consume all of the capacity and all of the time that you give to it. That's exactly what we're seeing playing out with the surface combatant. There are many reasons why the surface combatant is so problematic, but fundamentally, we didn't stick to schedule, and we just allowed things to drag out. I think the idea of shortcutting, although people get very nervous when you use that kind of language, I think it's entirely viable. The problem when you create a competitive environment by going out to industry and determining that, let's say, for example, you have half a dozen possible competitors, is that you now have to manage the expectations with respect to how the competition is going to play out. But at the end of the day, government gets to decide, and they can choose to play this any way they want. And we have seen recent examples. I mean, the P8 Poseidon is a great example. The jury's still out on whether there was or wasn't a viable option. But the bottom line is government was convinced this was an urgent requirement, and they made a decision and they implemented it, and they chose not to go any further. These are within the authority of government to make these decisions. There's risks. They can be very unpopular. They can be challenged. But fundamentally, and this, I think, goes to the essence of the problem, what is worse? Is it to deal with the unpalatability of making a decision to not compete something to the extent that you would in an ideal circumstance? Or is it you're not going to have the capability in a strategic environment where you need a capability? And this is, we have often defaulted to, we'll accept the risk on capability because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Well, no, it really does matter, and it's mattering more and more. And it's time as a nation that we accept that you can't have your cake and eat it too. So we have created these crises by allowing our capabilities to rust out, by not replacing things soon enough, by politicizing everything we do as it relates to defense procurement. And, I'm not saying that maybe the time has come in this particular case, but across the board, we can't continue to do things the way we've always done them and expect that somehow we're going to get a different outcome. I think the biggest challenge right here is the internal capacity of a very limited group of people to actually do the intellectual heavy lifting that's required to produce decision quality information for any government. And maybe there's opportunities here to reach out to one or two of our allies who have no skin in this competition. Okay. So that's code for maybe the Brits or the Americans, and say, how can we shortcut this? How can they help us get through this? How can we then produce decision quality information that allows us to shorten this timeline significantly? But we've got to think out of the box.
Mark, thank you for your comments. To close out this part of the discussion, I'll just turn to Luc. Luc, do you have anything to add or build on anything Bob and Mark have said?
A few more comments. I think they've covered the piece very, very well. I'll just add another lens to this. There's a lot of discussion in various media, in various rooms, through various political and military leaders, that will be in a major conflict before too long. We have a procurement system designed for peacetime, easy, cozy acquisition, where we look at through multiple lenses the benefit to society at large. If we do believe through strategic assessments and through our own validation inside of the national security empire, that the threat is real and that we can be dragged into a conflict within, these short timelines, then we need to think differently than the peacetime supplying, and we need to be ready to supply for war. And that requires different philosophy, different partnerships, and different way to look at things. So, I mean, they're big words. They're kind of drastic in some ways to some, but I think that represents encapsulate the urgency and say, we need to look at this differently, because if the bad days are really coming, and we need to make our contribution to world peace and stability in a more significant way than we've done it in the past, we need to get through this, not in the way we've done it in the past, but in a way that has this in mind, this reality in mind going forward.
Thank you, Luc. Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Mark. We could keep this conversation, I think, going for multiple episodes and multiple hours, but unfortunately we have to stop somewhere. We haven't covered everything today, but we've covered a lot, everything from procurement challenges and reform to emerging technologies and alliances and more. I appreciate all of you taking an hour out of your busy schedules to meet with the CDA and have this very important conversation. So thank you, and look forward to hopefully doing this again in the future at some point.
And that brings us to an end to our discussion today. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to leave a review, send us an email at josh@cdainstitute.ca, or reach out to us on social media. Your feedback helps us bring you content that's relevant and engaging. For more in-depth analysis and updates on national security and defense, be sure to visit our website at www.cdainstitute.ca, where you can find articles, reports, and more. Thank you for listening, and a big thank you once again to our guests, Mr. Mark Norman, Bob Davidson, and Luc Cassivi, for providing your thought leadership and expertise. Until next time.